If you're a human being on planet Earth, there's better than a 50-50 chance that your understanding of spirituality is based mainly on Abrahamic religions, where conveniently, you have a big old book containing everything you need to know about who you worship and what they did. So the jarring thing about learning an ancient mythology is that pagan religions often didn't have a codified belief system, let alone anything equivalent to a Bible. So learning about them is a matter of picking up the scattered bits and pieces that they left behind. And that goes especially for Norse mythology. Unlike, say, the ancient Greeks or Egyptians, the Vikings weren't the best about writing things down. Most of their writing was on runestones, which generally served as personal memorials. While their art might have depicted scenes from Norse mythology, their inscriptions usually just said something along the lines of, "Yo, this is Eric shouting out my boy Bjorn. He was a good dude, great at sailing boats and killing Christians. Rip, homie." So yeah, not much to go off of in terms of their folklore. Most of our information comes from poems and sagas that were composed in the Viking Age, but not written down till well after the Norse people converted to Christianity. The interesting thing about Old Norse poetry is that their meter was based on alliteration rather than rhyme. So in order to follow that meter, poets would make heavy use of Kennings, which are basically
a figurative reference to an individual, usually alluding to other existing myths. This was done in place of proper names when necessary to maintain the pattern of alliteration.
This is an extremely useful feature for us because it provides hints on myths that may not have survived to the present day. And speaking of myths that didn't survive into the present day, that's most of them. What we call Norse mythology is really just a sliver of a whole wealth of Scandinavian folklore that is just forgotten now. And so reading the stories that we do still have, you'll find yourself asking a lot of questions. What are the 9 worlds? Why did Odin make a blood oath with Loki? That sounds like a bad idea. How did Heimdall having 9 mothers work? Can you explain Norse cosmology to me? Because, why are there so many 9s? And the answer that any properly educated scholar on the subject will give you is, what's more, there are many straight-up contradictions and chronological inconsistencies from myth to myth. Probably because, as I said, the Vikings didn't have a Bible that they all read to keep the story straight, so their beliefs would have differed depending on the time, place, and the individual telling the story. So really, you could think of Norse mythology as a big jigsaw puzzle, with 90% of the pieces missing, and a few random pieces from different puzzles. The most valuable compilation of Old Norse poems is the Poetic Edda, which, while written down in the 1200s, is believed to contain poetry written well within the Viking Age. And around the same time the Poetic Edda was recorded, an Icelandic politician named Snorri Sturluson put together the Prose Edda. Snorri's goal was mainly to help preserve his people's style of Old Norse poetry. Back in his day, other European styles of poetry were becoming popular, which he wasn't a big fan of, so he put together this book as sort of a textbook on how to compose traditional Old Norse poetry. And thankfully, the subject matter he chose to tackle were his favorite stories about the Norse gods, making this another extremely valuable source for Norse mythology. The one problem, however, with the Prose Edda is the possibility of Snorri giving altered versions of these stories due to Christian influence. For one thing, he clearly doesn't want anyone to think he's actually a pagan because he starts off the book right off the bat saying, okay, just to be clear, this is all fake. Praise Jesus. And then he goes into this weird pseudo-historical explanation for where he thinks the Norse religion came from. Like he says that Thor was actually Hector from the Trojan War who fled to Northern Europe, and it's weird. You can skip that part. So yeah, the subject of Christian influence is a hot topic in Norse mythology discourse, especially regarding Snorri. Yes, there is Norse mythology discourse. For the most part, there's no definitive way of knowing whether things were added or omitted or altogether made up to better fit the sensibilities of the writer. I will say, however, from what I've seen, that modern scholars seem to be a lot less skeptical of Snorri than a lot of armchair internet experts who will tell you he's a garbage source. I personally think we're the ones who end up distorting the myths a lot with our own modern biases. For instance, when you're reading about Norse mythology, you'll hear mentions of elves and dwarves and giants, and you might have preconceived ideas of what those magical creatures look like, usually based on D&D races, but the Norse giants, or Jötunn, while sometimes described as being really big, most of the time seem to be the size of regular people. A more accurate translation of Jötunn is devourers, which has nothing to do with their size. Really, they can be thought of as simply another clan of gods like the Aesir and Vanir. Meanwhile, terms like elf and dwarf seem to be used interchangeably and not really refer to any specific kind of magical creature. Some seem like regular humans, some seem like gods, some are talking animals, one of them is a sewing needle. So yeah, the Vikings didn't really taxonomize their magical creatures. If you ask them the specific difference between an elf and a dwarf, I imagine their answer might have been, we're the ones who want to categorize everything like they're D&D races. So with all this in mind, if you're looking to get into Norse mythology, the Prose and Poetic Eddas are the place to start. I'll have links to both of them in the doobly-doo. I also highly recommend Jackson Crawford's channel. He's an expert on the Old Norse language with literally hundreds of videos covering every imaginable subject pertaining to Norse mythology. Also, a good quick reference guide for looking up things relating to Norse mythology is the website Norse Mythology for Smart People, but a word of warning. The creator of that website expresses some very strong opinions relating to Christian influence, and he acts like his takes are a lot more widely accepted among experts than they actually are. So any commentary you read on that site, just remember to take with, a fat grain of salt. Also, on a personal note, I really liked Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. It's a very modernized retelling of the classic Norse myths, so it's by no means research material, but I would say it's well worth a read if you're just looking for entertainment. Anyway, that's it. Like, subscribe, leave a comment if you like Thick Thor.